Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Gregory, and this is Chapter 1 lecture on Accounting 667 Advanced Audit. Now, I do want to say that I'm just going to do an overview of the chapter, so be sure to read all the material in it. It will help you understand the lecture even more. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the foundation of forensic accounting and fraud examination. So we're going to start back at the basics. But I wanted to show you a slide on what is fraud in a very simple illustration. This is fraud. There are over 30 different types of fraud that the ACFE, through the report to the nations, has identified. Now, I've put the report to the nations out in your class resources. It's going to be an excellent report for you to look at. It's got lots of charts and graphs and statistics, and really brings home what fraud is all about. Because when we use that word, we use it really liberally. As you can see, there are three main categories: corruption, asset misappropriation, and financial statement fraud. But look down in asset misappropriation. We have cash misappropriation. We have inventory. We have stealing of cash. We have stealing of cash receipts. We have accounts payables, accounts receivables fraud. We have forged makers. We have ghost employees. We have larceny. We have fraudulent sales. So many things to wrap ourselves around. We aren't going to be able to tackle all of these, but I want you to give some appreciation to the depth and breadth of this particular industry of forensics. So, what is fraud? As we've seen, it's a lot of different things, but down at its very essence is the fact that there is a knowing misrepresentation of something of material fact that induces another person, organization, entity to use it to their benefit or to harm others. The ACFE says, if you lie to deprive a person or an organization of money or property, you've committed fraud. Kind of simple. It is the act to deceive. So it's a misrepresentation of a material fact. Material is going to be important. It's known to be false. We find out that there are people or entities that know that the fact is false. People, shareholders, employees, other corporations relied on that misstatement. And the U.S. Supreme Court added one more element to it. You must have been harmed. You must have resulted in some kind of loss. There can be fraud out there, but if no one is harmed by it, then is it really fraud? Yes and no. That's one of those ethical questions we talk about. The textbook kind of dives away from fraud for just a second and says, well, what's abuse? A lot of people say that abuse of power is fraud, and that's true. It kind of falls underneath the idea of fraud and waste and abuse. So all three of them can kind of commingle a little bit, but they're also very distinctive. So let's go from the least of the bad to the bad of the bad. Waste is the misuse of an asset. Simply stated, we let inventory go bad. It becomes obsolete, intentionally obsolete. We could have an excessive waste of an office asset. For example, you go in and you print out 500 flyers that are non-work related on your company printer, that's waste. But it can also lead to abuse. Now, abuse, kind of in the middle of the bad things, is using an asset of the company, but for not its intended use. The biggest example could be using the company car for private use. You really shouldn't use a company car to go out to dinner with or go out and do some things with. It's the company car. So you're abusing the privilege of using that company car. Or sometimes people use their credentials, their position, for some type of preferential treatment. I am the CFO of a company, so I demand to have preferential treatment on an airline flight or maybe a hotel reservation, using your position. Fraud is really just the intentional act of deception for gain. Your gain, or sometimes you may be committing that fraud to make the company look better, to put the company in a gainful light. Now we want to see what forensic accounting is all about. Forensic accounting is really a lot of fun. We use our accounting knowledge and our accounting techniques when we have a legal dispute. So it's not all about fraud. It could be just about anything, and the textbook gives you a lot of examples, but here are just a few. You use forensic accounting to do background checks on potential employees. You do a credit check. You do a background check on them. You find out who they are, what they do. Are they the person that fit to go work for a company? Of course, you want to determine if there's irregularities versus errors in financial accounting processes. Maybe you're going to do an operational forensic investigation on the software you use to make sure that what goes into the system reports out correctly, that there's no errors or irregularities in the system. It could be providing some assistance to an audit team. People who are like me, who are certified fraud examiners, are often hired by audit teams who don't have that particular person to do an additional level of investigation into that audit to determine if there is some fraud present. We could do all kinds of consulting work. We're constantly out there helping organizations and companies with fraud prevention and deterrence programs. How can we build better internal control systems, for example? So forensic accounting really encompasses just a lot of different things. So don't think of it only about the investigation of fraud that occurs in the workplace. And as such, we have to have some unique skills. Of course, we have to have our technical skills as an accountant. We have to understand different analysis techniques. We have to look at how we do substantive testing. We have to understand the law and law enforcement procedures beyond the scope of just our accounting skills, which we need to have very good accounting skills because fraudsters are very good at hiding what they do. We have to employ investigative skills, and that's sometimes where the law enforcement, investigation, private investigator skills start to come out in you. We have to look at how do we collect evidence? How do we analyze and evaluate that evidence? So we have to understand what evidence is and what it's not, and how do we use critical thinking skills in analyzing and putting together the fraud scheme. And it may include interviewing subjects, either alongside law enforcement or on your own, depending on the scope of the career you go into. And finally, one of the biggest skills we have to learn is how do we communicate these results, not only to our client, but we may have to communicate the results to law enforcement agencies, to prosecutors or defendants, to the court, and to the jury. Now let's take a look at the differences and similarities between what auditing is, what fraud examination is, and what forensic accounting is, because they can be all interrelated depending on the circumstances that you have. So if we were looking purely at auditing, we're looking at an attestation to opine whether or not the financial records of an entity are free from material misstatement. Doesn't mean that there might be some errors there, but it's free from the material misstatement, which may mislead people to make decisions. Auditing isn't necessarily proving fraud, but in that auditing, we may find irregularities that we have to perform a fraud examination of. Or most of the time in fraud examinations, unfortunately, we are looking at the history because the act has happened. Either the act has happened and somebody has found out, the act has happened and somebody has gotten caught, or one time I consulted for a construction company and the person called me up on a Sunday morning and said his bookkeeper was in jail. Great. Because she stole money from his company. So we usually come in after the fact and we are looking to find out what happened and how we can implement corrective actions so that we minimize the risk that it happens again. And finally, like I said, what forensic accounting did. It's all kinds of different services. We could be looking at litigation services, divorce services, bankruptcy services, background checks of employees, creating monitoring programs, all kinds of things. So see how each of these may be interrelated with each other. We may have to do some measure of auditing when we're doing evaluation of a business, a litigation service. We may be doing auditing when we're doing fraud examination. So all of them work together, but they can also stand alone, again, depending on the circumstances. Now, as I've said before, I posted in your class resources the 2022 report to the nations. It's free. If you go onto the website, you can pull it down for yourself, but I've gone ahead and gotten a copy for you because there are some really interesting pieces of information in this. It's a survey that's conducted every 2 years to find out what's going on in the world of forensic fraud examination. And some really great statistics come up. We can look at what are the 5 highest median losses going on. Real estate, wholesale trade, transportation, construction, utilities. We know that organizations with the fewest employees really had the highest median loss. That's because there's usually a lack of segregation of duties. So people are manipulating the system. We can see the average loss per case. We learn about the perpetrators, who they are, what they are, how do they do it? Do they have some red flags? And then we really get into the schemes. There are old schemes that are being played out using new ways of doing them. There are new schemes coming out all the time. So with all of this information, it can be a little overwhelming if we're thinking about how we approach an investigation. Well, the first thing we need to do is we have to have two traits or characteristics, and they're learned characteristics. One is a characteristic of critically thinking, analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating the information that we gather, the evidence that we have that guides us to whether or not there may have been a fraudulent action. The second thing we want to look at is what we call professional skepticism. It's called having a questioning mindset. You want to go in thinking that there is going to be a fraud that has occurred. And you're going to do a critical assessment of the evidence before you to prove or disprove that. So you're going to create some hypotheses as to whether or not it could have occurred. And we also want to go in knowing that each fraud case we look at may go to court. So we have to be extremely thorough in our analyzing and synthesizing and evaluation. Back in the 30s and 40s, a man named Donald Sutherland coined the phrase white collar crime. And it was because it was the gentleman's crime. At that time, it was mainly conducted by men, and men of a certain position of authority, men that did not look like people who would rob you or steal you. So it gave this air of the executive, the worker, the professional. Well, his protege in the 50s, Donald Cressy, took that idea of white collar crime and broke it down into three basic components that made the fraud triangle. And we're going to see the fraud triangle over and over and over in this class, because fraud rests on any one of these tenets. The first one is the opportunity. Does the perpetrator have the opportunity to commit the fraud? Do they have motive and or pressure to commit the fraud? Is there something either internal within the corporation, such as meeting a specific benchmark of revenues that could apply pressure to that person? Could it be external? Does that person maybe have an addiction? Are they going through some hard times in their family? And finally, the tenet of rationalization. This is usually the hardest one to prove, but sometimes it's the easiest that comes out from the fraudster. Why did they do it? How did they rationalize that it was okay for them to commit fraud? Could be that they were passed up for a promotion. It could be that they thought of it as, well, I really didn't steal. I'm just borrowing from the company for a while and I'll pay it back. It's all good. So Donald Cressy created what's called the fraud triangle. And we use this as our basis for every fraud examination that we approach. So when we're looking at this, we look at the opportunity, the motive, the pressure, the rationalization, and we say, well, how does this operate in business? What kind of fraud could occur in business? Well, we have sometimes motivational fraud. Is management focused on those short-term gains or personal gains, such as compensation for results? You should never be compensated for meeting benchmarks, because if you're not meeting the benchmarks, you are going to do everything in your power to meet that benchmark to get that compensation, right? It's only natural. Is it a situation within the business? Is there opportunity for fraud? Poor internal controls. We leave checks unsecured. Perhaps your boss goes on vacation for a week and signs 10 checks and leaves them with you. That's a situational case where fraud could have an opportunity to occur. Maybe not by you, but maybe somebody else saw those checks go in a drawer. Behavioral issues within business. Are they a high-risk company? Are they sitting on the cutting edge? Or are they a family-owned business and they believe everyone is there for the same altruistic reason? And so there is this abnormal level of trust. So if you look at a fraud and you look at that opportunity, motivation, and rationalization, take a look at that and see, are those kinds of red flags coming up fitting in a motivation of the company, a situation within the company, or just a general behavior of the company? Now let's talk about how we begin to approach a fraud engagement. First, we have to find out what the issue is. What's the problem? Not the symptoms, but what is the problem? The symptoms could be, I have cash shortages every Friday from my retail tills. That's a symptom. We have to go back and find out what the problem is. The problem could be there's poor internal controls regarding the closing techniques, which lends this opportunity for that symptom to be created. We have to think of some what-if scenarios that could come as a result from those symptoms. Well, what if there aren't two people looking at the closing of that till? The hypothesis could be, if two people aren't looking at the till, it could create an opportunity for that problem of poor internal controls to exist. So once we understand what the engagement is, and sometimes that's going to take one or maybe 2, 3 interviews with the company to really come up and understand what the problem versus the symptoms are. Then we go into, okay, what evidence do we need to gather regarding it? What tests do we need to do? What observations do we have to have? And perhaps what interviewing do we need to perform to either prove that the hypothesis exists or dispute it? So a lot of this has to do with the financial data of the company. We're going to look at the books. We're going to do some testing. We're going to trace some accounts. We're going to observe people doing their job. We're going to review their processes. But what kind of non-financial data might we be gathering? It could be media news. Maybe this is a company on the verge of going public. There's a lot of risk involved. There's a lot of hype going on about it. There's a lot of focus being on it. It could be that you look at the people, the behavior. Do we have people all of a sudden driving high-priced vehicles or talking about the new home they just bought? Or maybe they're complaining about the cost of their private schooling for their child. So not only do you have to have your eyes open to fraud, you kind of have to have your ears open to fraud too. You have to be a good observer of people. And there's other things we can use too. First, you kind of have to think like a fraudster. Get into the mindset of how the fraud could occur. You might have to think back. How could this till be short? Well, what are some of the fraud schemes that we might be able to do that would end up shorting the till? So do we look at sales receipts? Do we look at a lot of voids? So we want to think about how that fraud could occur in order to understand what kind of substantive tests. I'm a very visual person, so I like charts and graphs and pictures, pictorials. You might have to draw some pictures out to look at the linear thinking of how the fraud occurred. So you may be looking at organization charts, timelines, changes of lifestyles. Boy, last week, Elaine was driving an old Toyota Corolla, and now she's driving, a BMW. Wow, how did she get that money? Sometimes we have to also employ other specialists, such as IT specialists, and do some big data analytics. One of the things that we're looking at now is how are we incorporating data analytics into the CPA exam. So that might be something you want to look at, is taking an analytics class. And finally, one of the things you need to do in the end is, unless you're working by yourself on a fraud, you usually will have a team that you're working with. Work as a team. Don't lose sight of the goal that's in front of you. The goal is to prove or disprove your hypothesis. There's a lot of methodologies we can use regarding fraud examinations. Some we do at the beginning, some we do in the middle, and some we do in the end. So something that we can do even pre-beginning is developing some predictive analysis. And that might be looking at issues such as economic analysis. What kind of issues are going on in the economy today that might lend itself to creating the circumstances that fraud might occur. For example, if inflation goes up, prices go up, then there may be a predisposition for some people in different economic circumstances that they may have to supplement their income through fraud. It could be having predictions based on meeting certain benchmarks and goals that could lead to fraud. If the economy is in a downturn, but you have a benchmark revenue requirement to meet for additional compensation, you're going to have to deal with that in order to be able to figure out a way to make that fraud occur so that you meet your compensation requirements, get your bonus reward, even during an economic downturn. So we have to think sometimes looking outside of the company or outside of the circumstances of people and predict whether or not fraud could occur. When we're in the middle of it, we can create some fraud prevention and deterrence, looking at our internal control structure, looking at how management's tone at the top is, what are some of the procedures that we have to follow and consequences if fraud should occur. Maybe we need to put cameras on our retail clerks. Maybe we need more training. And when fraud does happen, we have to do that detection and investigation. We have to be able to walk the talk, do the testing, create the hypothesis, determine if fraud has occurred. And then we have to also look to see if the tone of the top management is putting in those fraud prevention and deterrence methods, or if they're turning a blind eye to it, or if they're even encouraging it. And finally, at the end, we may be called in to look at the amount of loss and how that loss might be recovered. We might be involved in the legal process, and we might be there to assist the company in modifying their processes, procedures, and behaviors. So we can be before it even starts to after it has occurred. That's all for chapter 1. If you have questions, please post them in the class questions. You can reach out to me through Halo. You can set up a Calendly appointment or call me. I thought this quote was really interesting from Kenneth Lay, who ran Enron literally into the ground. He stated, "There are no accounting issues, no trading issues, no reserve issues, and no previously unknown problem issues." Oh, really? If you're interested, go back and look at the Enron case. It's a little complicated, but it's quite fascinating. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the classroom.